Welcome back, everyone, to Not Another Podcast. We are so happy to have you back once again with us. And as per usual, my name is Sipo or Guana, joined today by my two co-hosts, Sunshine, Msane, and Dimasilwana. And we have two more guests this time around. We have Sheldon Grebe, good friend of ours from way back, and Kelly Chandler, counseling psychologist from East London. And we're here to discuss something very serious and touchy. So, we're confronting one of the toughest conversations that we often avoid, and this is the crisis surrounding men's mental health in South Africa. It's a crisis we can no longer afford to ignore, not when the numbers speak this loudly. So, in South Africa, more than 75% of suicide victims are men. The suicide rate for men is 4 times higher than that of women. This country ranks 10th globally for suicide rates according to the World Health Organization. And despite these numbers, only about 1 in 4 South African men with mental health issues ever seek help. Depression in men often goes undiagnosed or untreated due to social stigma, cultural expectations, and a lack of accessible mental health resources. And mental illness is the third leading contributor to the national disease burden in South Africa. Yet men are the least likely to be in therapy or talk openly about their struggles. These aren't just statistics, these are stories. Stories of men we know, men we've lost, men who are suffering in silence because we've built a society that equates vulnerability with weakness. Too often, men are taught to tough it out, stay strong, and suffer quietly. But silence doesn't heal, it harms. So tonight we're making space. Space to talk, space to listen, space to shift the narrative. Because until we start talking about it, we're part of the problem. And if we want to change that for ourselves, our brothers, for the next generation, then it starts here. Let's get into it. So, welcome once again to Sheldon and Kelly. I'm going to give it over to Sheldon to talk about what brought him here and why he felt the need to join us on this episode. And then we'll move on to Kelly to give us just a brief intro about herself and the kind of work she does and why she's also here today. So over to you, Sheld.
Thanks for allowing me the opportunity to join you guys on this. So just basically to give you a little background, I think mental health is something that I've suffered for a while, but haven't acknowledged it. And recently I've done a lot of internal work and a lot of work on myself. And I had a look at the stats, like you spoke about the stats and how crazy they are. And I was like, okay, clearly I'm not the only one just feeling this way. And I started thinking, but why do I feel this way? And I thought to myself, okay, how do we break the generational curse? Like, how do we prevent our sons and our sons' sons to not go through what we're going through? And saw Hawks posted on, I think it was on Instagram, he was going to do a podcast, and I reached out to him and I was like, bro, let's talk about men's mental health. Because I don't have the answers, and I don't think a lot of us here don't have the answers either. So I think from our side, like, I just want to maybe share a bit from my side what I think causes mental health issues within men. So personally, I think if we look at society, when it comes to women empowerment, there's a lot more we need to do, but I think we've made advancements in that sphere. But I think when it comes to the men, we expected men exactly to stay the same. If you look at the gender roles and relationships and stuff, we never adjusted that. Or we never assisted men as to how they can adjust to that. Where now, if you look at your grandparents, your grandmother would be a stay-at-home mom and she'd look after the kids. Nowadays, relationships aren't like that. It's 50-50. And we've just kind of never assisted men to understand, okay, look here, things have changed and this is how it's changed. On that note, also, I just want to say, guys, if you guys want to like chip in here, you're more than welcome just to chip in and just comment if you want to comment on the notes that I make. And I know Hawks has got a whole list of questions that we'll dive into later. Anyway, Hawks spoke earlier about therapy also, and guys going into therapy and that. And I'll admit also, when I first mentioned to someone, look, I'm in therapy, it took a lot, because the moment you kind of say you're in therapy, you feel like, hey, this person's going to feel sorry for me. They're going to give sympathy, and that's not what you want, you know? And I had a discussion about therapy on the weekend with a friend of mine, And she actually said the suicidal rates in men is a lot higher, but what we also need to look at is how many men actually go to therapy compared to how many women go to therapy. And that's maybe why the rates are so much higher in men, because with women, a lot more women are in therapy and they're doing the work and they're getting the help. And they just before we go on, and another thing I also just want us to dive into is like, if we look at how we raise our kids, when you've got a boy and he falls and he gets hurt, you tell him, get up. Boys don't cry. But when you have a girl and she falls, you nurture her. So it's something we also need to look at and think to ourselves, are we raising our children the right way? Like you want to raise a tough son, but you don't want to raise like a girly son. But how do we find that happy medium? And from all these things, how do we break these generational curses that we can raise children better so that they don't go through the things we go through?
Lovely, lovely, Sheldon.
Very interesting
And this
points.
is part of the part of the discussion and the narratives we will dive into this episode and give it the attention it deserves. So I'll give it over to Kelly, and yeah, she can just lead the way in terms of who she is, why she's here, the kind of work she does, and we'll get straight into it, man. So Kelly, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Kelly Chandler, as people's already said. I'm a counseling psychologist here in East London, South Africa. The reason I'm here is because I was invited, but I was really eager to join because it's actually a topic I've spoken on before, and it was through being invited to talk the first time that I realized how much effort people are still having to do to get these conversations started. And I guess because I'm so deeply in mental health conversations all the time, you somewhat lose sight of what conversations are happening outside of that space. And I realize there's actually still a lot of groundwork that needs to happen. As Sheldon has said, and he's raised a lot of really excellent points of the challenges of mental health issues in South Africa, of men not coming into therapy. And I think the conversation we're having today is how do we get people to how do we get men to think of coming to therapy? Because yes, there's a lot of work that can happen there, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen in our society, in our conversations we're having within our families, within our friend groups, to get people to come into therapy. So that's the main reason I've joined in this conversation today. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be here to talk on this. I'm very passionate about mental health in general, but especially for men and for other minorities that are underserviced and not getting access to these essential support services. Yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Great, amazing. So yeah, let's just get right into it, guys. So I think my first question, Kelly, would be, where exactly are we going wrong as a society when it comes to men's mental health and just the general stereotypes and yeah, just the general stereotypes we have about men and men's mental health? Like, where are we going wrong as a society in terms of helping and supporting men?
Thanks, Sibo. That's an excellent question. I struggle so much with that word of wrong because it creates this duality of what's wrong and what's right. And I prefer a conversation around what's useful and what's not. When people come into therapy, that's often the question they'll ask is, what's wrong with me? Like I'm broken. And I'm like, you're not a thing. You're not a material. You're not broken. You're not yet to be fixed by me. That's not my job. I'm going to facilitate a process for you. What is the process that you want to be facilitated? What is no longer useful in your life? So I think the question we ask is, what is not useful in the way that we are seeing gender dynamics and gender roles? So when we talk about gender roles, we often speak about hegemonic or dominant masculinities, which essentially refer to those that are most prominent or most valued in our society, and they are typically white men, cisgender men, heteronormative men, those that are privileged, those that are able-bodied, and yes, otherwise that tough, strong Johnny Bravo type. The issue is that there are many people that for many a variety of reasons, cannot achieve that kind of masculinity. And it also over time has come with issues of being opposed to any kind of femininity within males or masculinities. It's rejecting of a lot. It creates a lot of division. It creates a lot of expectation of not really being in touch with your emotions, right? So I think something that stuck out for me from what Sheldon has mentioned is not raising a girly boy. Well, what is a girly boy? What are we referring to, right? So if a man, is in touch with their emotions, is that girly? Right? And in a lot of narratives in homes, in cultures, yes, that's what is either explicitly or implicitly believed. That if you are in touch with your emotions enough that you are showing them and expressing them, that is girly and that's a problem for a man. Whereas if we step outside of that and if we recognize that emotions are expressed regardless of gender and create spaces in our communities, and what I mean by community is in your friend group, in your family, where you have conversations about, well, how do you see emotion? What are your emotions? Are you in touch with them? Are you able to express them? Do you have spaces where that's safe? And if you don't, that's where we're starting. If there's something that is no longer useful, that's what's no longer useful, is having that be something that's taboo.
Interesting. I like what you said about in terms of emotions, because emotions are something that are innate in all of us. It's not masculine or feminine. It's not a masculine or feminine thing. It's something that makes us human. You know, you can't just have just rationality all the time, whether you're male or female. And these are one of the stereotypes that really hold us back as a society in terms of how we raise our children. And I believe that once people start looking at things differently in terms of understanding your emotions, because it begins with having self-awareness, understanding that this is what I'm feeling right now and it's okay to feel that way. And this is something that is not is not limited to just women only. Men need to understand that it's okay to feel down. It's okay to be vulnerable at times. It's okay to cry if you're feeling overwhelmed, stressed out, and sad, because many men do this in silence, not in public, and therefore they feel ashamed of reaching out for help as they feel like that's a sign of weakness. And I'll just give it over to Dima if he has any questions that he would like to expand on regarding this topic.
Yes. So, firstly, welcome, Kelly. Welcome, Sheldon. I think we've already raised a few very interesting points when it comes to the duality of masculinity, because Sheldon made the point of where do we find the gray area when it comes to raising boys? You know, what do we do when we want to raise our boys to be, I guess, tough or resilient? But at the same time, we don't want to make our boys, I think what Sheldon meant to say was overly sensitive. So you want your boy to have a healthy balance of being in touch with his emotions, but also being able to take a lot. But also, I think we also need to speak about how exactly do young men or boys channel their troubles? Who do they turn to? Where do they even begin when they have certain issues? What questions do they ask? Because we already have this perception in society where a man must be tough or resilient, but at the same time, at the other end, there is this expectation of not being too soft. So where exactly can we start to affect the change? And are we paying enough attention to our boys when we're talking about young boys? Because what I've noticed is that there's a lot of talk when we're addressing certain issues in society like gender-based violence, etc. We talk about it from an adult perspective when the damage is already done. And we have people who have certain dispositions or who are preying on society, and at that point, I don't think there's any real rehabilitation that can be done realistically. But what we can do is start to affect the change from the ground level. So, what kind of attention can we? I guess what I want to say, Kelly, is what are we not doing for our boys currently? What exactly are we not addressing? And how can we begin to affect that change, starting with our little boys, but also trying to raise resilient young men, but who are also in touch with their emotions in a healthy, well-rounded way?
Thank you for that, Ndima. I'm gonna give you a disclaimer. Yeah, I'm gonna plug my friend because she's actually doing a retreat on this exact topic. Now in July for Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Her name is Nosipiwo20 and it's called Boys Will Be Human, right? And I love your question because it's kind of a chicken and an egg situation. Is we've got men who are raising, all right, young men and kids with certain beliefs that they were raised with. And if those are problematic beliefs that leave room for this kind of hegemonic masculinity to move in and take over, then that's a problem, right? Because it is going to carry over to the next generation. So I will respectfully disagree that when a person is already a man, they're, an adult, they're fully developed, that there's nothing that can be done. The perspective I practice from is that, yes, there are certain conditions where it is extremely difficult to effect change once a person has reached full maturity. For when we're talking about perspectives and beliefs, though, there is often a lot of work that can be done. It depends how receptive the person is to that work. So if a man comes into therapy and they're saying that, I was raised that you must be really, really tough, you mustn't express your emotion, this is what manliness looks like, and you've got to work this kind of job, and you don't let anyone take advantage, but they're telling you that they're also really depressed and they're very anxious. And you often start to work with those beliefs and you say, well, what do you think a man should be, right? And what do you disagree with about how you were raised? And the difference here is it's not about placing blame on the people who raised you. They did the best that they could with the knowledge that they had at the time, probably. It's about saying, well, this is what I think could have been different, right? Okay, great. How do you want to start to implement that? Because yes, you do have a young man at home that you are modeling their experience. Everything you are doing, the way that you are handling your conflict, the way you are treating their mom, the way you are treating yourself. They are seeing that, they are learning from that. I was raised in a household of don't do what I say, don't do as I do, right? And I frequently have to tell parents, I'm terribly sorry, but that is not how your child's programming works. That is not how our brains work. We take in everything that we see, and more so than what we are being told. So if you are a man coming into therapy with beliefs that you feel like it's too late to change, but you start to experiment with making these changes in your life, you go home, and instead of having the drink because you had a terrible day of work and fighting with mom because, I had a terrible day at work and now I'm drinking a bit and there's just a little bit of disinhibition happening, you kind of, okay, I'm not going to have the drink. And I'm going to go and sit with my son and I'm going to say to them, I feel really frustrated today. Can we go kick the soccer ball around? And he's going to look at his dad and he's going to go, yeah, is that what you do when you're frustrated? You kick the soccer ball? Yes, let's try it.
That's a very good start. And then what would you say are also other solutions in terms of changing the narrative around the stigma of raising boys and the whole boys don't cry type of thing? And also, how do we raise boys and girls to be more holistic, and how do we debunk those biases from between genders from a very young age? I like what you said about finding different types of coping mechanisms and and also letting parents understand that children follow their parents' example, not necessarily what they say, they watch what they do, and that's what it is. So how do we begin to change that narrative, and how do we start debunking the biases between little boys and little girls?
I thought about this a lot as I was preparing, and I know what the textbook says, right? The reality is that you start wherever it's possible for you, because yes, it's intimidating, as Sheldon shared from his own personal experience, even to tell somebody that you're in therapy is something that it's vulnerable, it's scary, because you don't know how it will be received. You don't know if there is stigma that is existing in that situation, right? You start where it's possible for you. You pick the relationships that you feel like are safe. I can talk to my mates about this. He's the person who's always picked up the call when I was calling, right? And you test those waters and you say, how do you deal with the stress in your life? Because yes, we all have different experiences of our stresses, but we also can have a shared ground, right? We know that economics are stressful, politics are stressful, lack of infrastructure is stressful. You start there. If your friend says, and you know your friend quite well, and you can pick up that they're maybe not their usual self, you say, dude, how are you? Like, really, how are you? And if you can see he's going towards, I'm fine, you say, it looks like you're quite stressed. How are you? It starts like that. It starts with going to your folks, to your siblings kids, and having those conversations of, we were raised in a household like this. What do you believe about mental health? What is mental health to you? This has been my experience of it, right? And it's not easy and it's intimidating, especially with maybe an older generation that doesn't necessarily share similar beliefs. But just being vulnerable in sharing your own experience. And if your experience is different than what they believe, helping them to understand your experience. Obviously, I'm saying this with caution because you don't want to do this in a space that you know is not safe. If your mom or your dad or your sister is going to say to you, nah, that's nonsense, just go to church. Or, nah, that's nonsense, you need to go and speak to the traditional healer. Then don't do it in that space, right? That's not the space to start then. Start somewhere that is safe just so that you can practice these skills of talking about this. And then you go from that space and you go, how do we spread this further? Who can you talk to, right? Because yes, we can do this on macro levels. We can do this amazing podcast. We can speak on radio stations. We can have community events. Often that is not nearly as effective as starting within your own home, because everyone will nod their head and say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And then they'll go home and say, I still want to have a tough son, right? Because this is huge societal norms we're talking about. They don't change with one event. They change with many people in a community starting to think differently. Well, how do we make that happen? We start within our friendships, within our families.
It's very, very interesting, Kelly. So I'm glad that you gave us a lot of perspective on how exactly we can go about listening to people and actually asking people how they are, because I think particularly with men, we don't do that very often. I can't even remember the last time someone came to me, or when I even went to one of my friends or any man that I know, and simply just sat down with them and said, how are you doing? How are you feeling today? But I also just have a question along that same topic when it comes to how we can help our fellow men. And do you think that it's effective enough for us to simply, when we can identify that there's a problem with a friend or a family member, etc., is it enough for us to simply sit with someone and just be with them in the moment? Because sometimes we can't relate to what people are going through. We can see that they're going through something, but we don't know where to start. We don't know what questions to ask. We don't want to be preachy because, again, we don't really relate. So do you think it's enough for us to sometimes just be with someone and just be present? Not to necessarily say anything, but just to be there for the person physically until maybe they're ready to open up and actually start the dialogue for themselves and set the tone, and then you then can ask the questions and support them however you can. So is it enough for us to, or is it effective for us to sit with people and just let them feel comfortable enough to talk?
That is a really good question, and I hear that question. I think one thing I want to make a side correction to is that like we don't ask about how are you feeling. Talking about feelings is top tier. It's the more difficult area. Before we even get to the feelings part of it, just ask your mate, how are you? Right? Talk about life. Just start there of, let's just have a conversation. Like in couple therapy, we'll talk about active listening, right? Active listening is you're not listening to respond. You are just listening to what are the words this person is saying, what is the meaning I'm making of them, and that means reflecting it back to them. This is what I hear from what you're saying. Yes, at some point, if there is that safety in the relationship, and what I mean by that is if it's a quality relationship where I already know there's, and when I say relationship, I refer both to maybe romantic as well as just to friendship, familial, right? Just, do I know for sure that there's no judgment here? This is a person that does listen to me and does understand me usually, right? And just making a space for a person to talk. Because the problem is that if you have been raised in a family, right, or whatever kind of situation where essentially your emotional language, your emotional vocabulary is like minimal, you don't have that capacity at that point to talk about, yeah, I feel annoyed about this, or I feel extremely angry about this, right? So it's not useful yet. That's something that has to be built up over time, right? Whereas somebody who comes from a very emotionally attuned family and it's constantly reflected to you, oh, you're a bit sad today. Oh, you're so excited. Oh, you're angry. You're so angry today. They grow up with a fully developed emotional vocabulary, and they are far more equipped then to be able to recognize within themselves and to recognize within others, this is what's going on and this is how I respond to this. So just starting with somebody by making room to have a conversation and then figuring out later, is there room to talk about, well, like, okay, so when your girlfriend said this to you, like, okay, well, what did you do? Oh, okay, well, what were you thinking when you did that? Okay, well, how did you feel? Right? That's something that can happen later, but yes, to answer your question of, is it sufficient just to have those conversations? Yes and no, right? I don't want to oversimplify things. There are times when you know a person is at risk. If a person has ever talked about potentially harming themselves or harming somebody else, that is a time where if they're a minor, you get their next of kin involved. If that's not a possibility, you get them to emergency services. There are situations we don't mess around with, right? And if there's any kind of suicidality or active suicidal intent, that is a time where you take action. But if it's essentially, so one of the questions that people had for me was basically, how do you kind of see how somebody is doing, right? Well, we use what is called the Global Assessment Functioning Score. And the reason I mention this is because it's something that you can use as a framework for understanding how the people around you are doing as well and how you are doing. So when we do this assessment, it's essentially looking at, well, how is this person's functioning? And functioning is, how are they doing in their work life or their school life? How are they doing emotionally? How are they doing socially? Right? So are they eating normally? Are they sleeping normally, right? Or are they drinking more than they usually would? Are they avoiding people? Are they the person who would text you back every couple of days and now you haven't heard from them in 2 weeks? It's things like that where you just kind of take record of, something's changed here. And then you ask that in sort of intentional question of, how are you? Right? And if they say, no, I'm fine, you say, well, like, I noticed, that you seem a bit down lately, or, hey, man, I haven't heard from you in a long time. Like, really, how are you? Let's get together. Let's have a cup of coffee. Let's go for a walk. Whatever, let's go play a game of squash. Right? You make that space, you kind of offer a lifeline in terms of, yeah, you don't necessarily have to hear their full life story in that moment, but yeah, is an opportunity for connection. Will you take it? I really want you to take it.
Mm.
All right, no, understood. Welcome, Kelly. Welcome, Sheldon. Kelly, I just have two questions. My first question is regarding vulnerability. So, how do we deal with the situation where, for instance, some people are really dealing with traumatic cases? So, for instance, let's assume a man has been raped, and that man is not comfortable telling their family and perhaps not comfortable telling their friends because they fear of being ashamed, and perhaps maybe not also willing to go to a therapist. What do we do? How do we create as men, at least in the immediate, safe spaces for them to be vulnerable regarding that situation, since they can't turn to their family, can't turn to their friends, and they can't turn to therapy because already there's stigma behind that. How do we assist such men? Are we allowed to actually seek assistance for the person without their permission? And to just see that through their patterns and daily behaviors that, okay, perhaps this person needs assistance, and maybe speak to a Kelly to try and assist that particular individual, or do we step back? What do we actually do? And secondly, in terms of the coping mechanisms, I just want to find out, how do we strike a balance between, because I noticed that there was research done that, look, some people use gym to cope, go to the gym a lot. Some people I think it was besides the gym, some people actually are workaholics. So let's assume I'm being a workaholic, and I'm trying to cope away from this depression and so forth. How do I strike a balance between knowing that me being a workaholic is assisting me from being depressed, or me going to the gym excessively is actually assisting me from being depressed, or is actually detrimental to the progress I should be making and with all my mental health issues?
Thank you for that. Two great questions. This sort of scenario that's posed with somebody who has been sexually assaulted, it's a challenging one because let's assume that nobody sort of was aware of what had happened. In cases of trauma like that, usually you will see, like I've spoken about, sort of functioning, right? You will see changes in their functioning. You will maybe see them be less willing to go out, or more on edge in certain situations, right? Again, I sort of, and please excuse me if I'm being redundant, but I go back to what I was saying before, where it's not always about making the big intervention, because the issue is that if that person is not yet in the space for that, all you are doing is once again removing their control in a situation, which is hugely damaging, right? So it's starting small. First, start with creating a safe connection, right? Reflect to them. It doesn't matter how many times it takes. I've noticed this. I'm concerned about this. I care about you, right? So, yes, if it gets to a point where you feel that they are at risk, right? They are vulnerable or potentially taking their own lives or something like that, or potentially getting vengeance on the perpetrator, then yes, that is unfortunately sometimes where you have to intervene to a point of taking them to a hospital, right? But sometimes it doesn't have to get there if you just create sort of a safe relationship where you provide a person with, like, I know maybe you can't talk to me and maybe you don't want to go to a psychologist because I understand maybe you're worried people might judge you for this action. Here are some, free helplines, right? SADAG has a WhatsApp line. You don't even have to call if you're not comfortable calling. All of those are completely anonymous. You can call, you can share what you want to. They're not going to compel you to do anything. So as challenging as it is to be the person who maybe is aware of something that you know others are not aware of and that this person is not seeking support for, be mindful of respecting their self-efficacy, them being able to take that action if and when they are able to. There is a delicate line there, because if you are worried they're going to hurt themselves, yes, you do have to take action. What you can still do in that moment is explain to them, I've really tried to support you to take this action yourself, and I can see you're not ready to, but I can also see that you are really potentially a risk to yourself, and this is what I'm going to do next. And I hope you can understand why I'm taking this choice for you, right? Even just explaining to someone, this is the action I'm going to take for you right now because I don't think you're able to do it for yourself, is more supportive than just doing it with no explanation of how and why you did it.
Definitely.
Yeah. Just in terms of the second part of your question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I actually need a reminder. What was your second part of the question?
With striking a balance between your coping mechanisms. So, like, some people do excessive gymming, some people end up being workaholics. Like, how do you strike a balance? Like, you go to the gym obviously to do the right things, but then maybe excessive gymming sometimes is not too good. So, how do you strike a balance between that?
That's a great question. Just in terms of stigma, we don't talk about mental. I always make the example to clients of, if your doctor told you had diabetes, right, and now you've got to take this medication, do you go, oh my gosh, no, that's terrible, no one can ever know, that's horrible? Or do you go, oh, okay, yes, absolutely, I'm going to take this medication, and they say, okay, you also have to make lifestyle changes. Okay, yes, I'm going to do that, right? And somehow people are more receptive to it when it's a medical issue. And the reason being is that there is always some level of, or there are incorrect assumptions and myths about a person being to blame for their own mental health challenges, right? Whereas even with diabetes, even if you are to blame because you've taken poor lifestyle decisions, there's somehow the doctor's telling you this is what's happened in your body. This is it. This is how you change it, right? So it's I'm taking a long route here, but it's how we think about these things, right? So it's you being in tune with yourself. And I always reflect to people who come into therapy with me, nobody knows you better than you know you, right? Yes, you're here and I am a professional and I've had extensive training, but you are best equipped to tell me what your experience of your life story and in your own body is. I'm not going to better tell that story than you. I can facilitate telling that story differently if it's useful for you, but you are best equipped to tell that story. So it comes down to self-awareness. Are you aware of how you are functioning? What is the reason that you're going to the gym, right? Do you get that feeling of I'm de-stressing, I'm letting it all go, I'm sweating it out, and I leave and I'm relieved and I feel really good? Or do you go and you go and you go and you feel no change, right? So earlier I was asked about how do we create holistic well-being in children, in young men. We start with ourselves. We start with knowing in all these different areas of my life. So again, I'll say emotionally, socially, in our work functioning, how are you, right? Are you taking strain at work and you are having poor conflict management? Are you constantly getting in trouble for fighting with people or having unnecessary altercations? How are things at home? Do you have good familial relationships or do you avoid the relationships in your life because I'm always getting in a fight, right? Socially, do I have really good social relationships where I go and I feel supported and I enjoy myself? Or is it a case of I go out every weekend, I get drunk, I feel extremely guilty, then I don't do it for quite a long time. I avoid people. It really comes down to how much insight does a person have into themselves and how they are doing.
Great, great
Sips, I just got a
answers.
question there for Kelly.
Yeah, I was about to say I'm gonna hand it over to you, bro. Sorry
Oh,
about that.
shut. So Sunshine asked a good question there on the coping mechanisms and that, like gym and work and that. So personally, when I'm busy, I'm fine. When I gym, I'm fine. When I'm working, I'm fine. I think the toughest times for me always come when I'm left alone with my own thoughts. That's when the tough times get there. So something that my therapist has advised to help me with that is like journaling. So I find that helps for me also. But I just want to know from Kelly is there any other coping mechanisms that people can look at using that they can do, but not when they're busy, when they're in their own space, other than journaling, anything else?
That's awesome, Sheldon. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is something that many people do struggle with. because we are sort of in a system and in a society where we are really constantly expected to be busy and be doing something. And so actually there's often very little time for reflection on these kind of things, which is also a breeding ground for trouble, right? I encourage you that even if you are fine when you are busy doing this, that, and whatever, to look beyond that, right? And to really, so one thing is to force yourself to take stock of, well, what is my fine on all of these various levels. So when I wake up in the morning and I'm going to work and I know I'm going to be busy, but really, how did I wake up feeling, right? Give yourself a number out of 10. 10, like excellent, 0, bad, really bad. Give yourself a number and say, okay, cool, so maybe how come I woke up feeling that way, right? Have awareness right from the very beginning of the day of how am I really feeling in this day? And then yes, okay, cool, go about the rest of your day, continue. It's constantly about implementing that awareness throughout. And then, yes, awesome journaling, exercise. Exercise truly is very much a golden key to our well-being. It unlocks all of our good neurochemicals that we need. Then also, forgive me for saying so, but mindfulness, meditation, visualization, breathing. I think I talk to every single person that sits on my couch about breathing. It is one of the greatest hacks to our regulation, right? So our nervous system regulation. When you are struggling, so especially people who are anxious, when you are anxious, it is very difficult to think in a rational way. Like, okay, this is silly. I know I don't need to reasonably be worried about this. Unfortunately, if you're already quite anxious, that's not going to get through. But if you do deep breathing and you force the body to relax and the body sends the messages to the brain that kind of say, okay, no, cool, everything's fine. Like really, we're not at risk. We are okay. Then that rational part where you can have those conversations with yourself of like, okay, cool, I know reasonably this is not something to worry about, is going to be more effective again. So yes, implementing breathing. So anytime you feel like my thinking is not great, like I'm worrying about things I don't usually, am feeling more on edge, more irritable than I usually would, sit somewhere and breathe and bring that part of your mind back online and then have that conversation with yourself. Where am I? What's my number? What was happening before? What got me here? How did I respond? How do I want to respond next time? If you're not satisfied with that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I think the biggest takeaway there is the self-awareness and the self-check. I think that's if I think I asked Sunshine, Dima, and Sipo, I don't know how often you guys do a self-check a day. I don't think I've done one in 10 years. You
yeah, I'm
understand? So
actually, yeah.
that's some really good advice there, yeah.
So just to answer your question, Sheldon, I'm actually very big on journaling and meditation. I'm a very introspective person. I do my best to journal daily. I practice meditation every day. Been doing so since 2016, so it's about 9 years now. And honestly, to tell you the truth, it saved my life. I think I would have lost my mind long ago had it not been for meditation, because what meditation teaches you is more than anything to be present in the moment, you know? Like Kelly was talking about the breathing and self-regulation. It helps you understand how you function and how your body reacts to certain stimuli. And what it does is that it gives you the space between yourself and the stimuli so you can have better control of your responses. And some of the benefits, sorry about that, some of the benefits that I've experienced through meditation is being calmer, having a greater retention in terms of my memory, being able to remember things a lot better, being more in tune with my intuition, being more aware of my surroundings, and also being better able to control and regulate my emotions, you know. And with journaling, because with journaling you get to understand your thoughts from a different perspective. Just just the process of writing down your thoughts and reading them to yourself and seeing them, like visually seeing your thoughts instead of them being inside your head all the time, that gives you a perspective and it gives you the space to better control your thoughts and understand the emotional state that you were in while you were writing down these thoughts, and that gives you better self-control, better discipline, and it helps you with your self-awareness overall. So those are two great coping mechanisms that I would encourage everyone to do if you're not doing it already. And then I just want to ask a question quickly if Ndima doesn't have anything to say, or I can always just ask it afterwards.
Now you can go ahead. I'll ask after.
Okay, so I want to move on to like the family dynamics when it comes to mental health and mental issues. Like, what are some of the long-term effects when it comes to abuse, whether it's verbally, psychologically, or physical abuse? What are some of the long-term effects on a child's mental health when it comes to that?
Thank you so much for that question. Sure. So we collectively term this adverse childhood events, right? And that can include having someone in your primary household who has struggled with substance abuse, if you've ever had somebody in the family who's struggled with their mental health, having lost a parent, whether that is because they have abandoned the family or whether they have died. It's quite a extensive list. So we refer to these as the ACEs, adverse childhood events, and their impact on functioning and mental health functioning is absolutely huge, right? So I think one of the questions was, how does a trauma impact addiction? And you're asking, like, these kind of family dynamics, how do they impact mental health and well-being? They impact every part, right? So if we just start with kind of basic attachment theory, and I will be clear here that we obviously live in a country where not everyone is raised in a nuclear family, and that is not inherently an issue. The issue comes in where there is not at least one primary attachment relationship, and that can be with mom or dad or grandma or makazi, anyone. It doesn't matter, right? As long as the quality and the consistency of that relationship is good, meaning that from infancy, right? Infancy being 0 to 6 months, that person, when the child cried, they were there. When they needed to be fed, they were fed. And more importantly than just basic meeting of needs, emotional regulation. So babies they don't have any awareness of how they are feeling. They just have physical needs that need to be met. And so it first starts out with, are my physical needs met? And very quickly it becomes, when I smile, do you smile back? Right? When I reach out, do you hold my hand? And that is the very beginning of their emotional regulation. That when I'm reaching out, I am held, right? When I am showing some sort of emotion, that emotion is mirrored back to me. And as they get older and they develop language abilities, I'm reflecting to this baby, you're laughing, you're happy, you're sad, right? That is the beginning of how they learn to regulate themselves. And if there isn't great availability at that point, or the person is there, they're physically meeting the needs, but perhaps they are having their own mental health struggles or substance abuse struggles or domestic abuse issues, and so they are emotionally unavailable, we end up with insecure attachment. And that has really far-reaching impact in terms of how a person's emotional domain develops. That I may feel more at risk than somebody else does because from a very early time, even pre-memory, I've not felt like my needs were met. So it has an impact on whether somebody does develop a substance abuse issue because they may have poor awareness of their own emotional regulation. And so they may wish to detach via means of a substance, or because they've not had that kind of mirroring of emotional regulation, they may struggle to do that for themselves. And so it's a child who is in the classroom and they get shouted at for being too active or for hitting their friend, right? And then that referral comes to me and it's the teacher writes suspected ADHD. So the research shows us that young men or young boys are perhaps overdiagnosed with ADHD, with autism spectrum, with these behavioral issues because we've perhaps incorrectly come to assume that men are more likely to have externalizing behavior, and women are more likely to have internalizing issues. So externalizing being substance abuse, anger issues, that kind of thing. Internalizing being anxious, depressed. Whereas it's not necessarily a true representation. We make this assumption and then that assumption leads us to biased diagnosing. So it's really important, even for a healthcare professional, to be aware of their own may hold. And when you receive that referral from the teacher, are you looking holistically at the child? Are you comprehensively assessing? Are you looking at how are things at home? What happened before when the child was at school, right? So, and I'm going to circle back around here to that kind of self-regulation. Something I've realized that's extremely important is our sensory regulation. So many people, and this does connect to the ACEs that I've mentioned before, have really poor sensory regulation, meaning that either I am under or over attuned to sound, right? Maybe I'm sound sensitive, or I frequently make a noise because it actually soothes me, or I don't like certain textures, or I really find certain textures soothing, right? I can go on and on about this. So we have to be really careful to take into consideration when we're looking at a young man or a man's mental health, how have they experienced their world from an emotional perspective, but even from the perspective of just their sensory experience of their world. And sometimes it's intervening with these small interventions at these different levels that end up making huge impact.
Very, very interesting, Kelly. So I'm glad we're now touching on this part of the topic because I wanted to talk about what role abandonment has on the mental health of children. But since this is specifically about men and boys, how much of a role does the sense of abandonment that a lot of kids sense, how much of a role does that play on them? Because as we know, and you did mention this before earlier on, that we do as a country have a very high rate of single parent households. And you did make the point that very early on, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But once children start to come into a sense of self and they start to analyze their surroundings, and they may even start to compare their lives with the lives of their peers or their friends, and they see their friends with their mom and dad, and for better or for worse, but they see a different dynamic from what they live. So whether it's a child living with their mother or with their father, but in the instance where there is a parent missing in that environment, we know that children do see that and they start to internalize it, and they ask themselves the question of, where's my mom or where's my dad, and why are they not here, etc. And in my own experience, I do have a bit of experience working with children in rural communities, in schools specifically. And one thing that I observed was that there was a lot of, specifically with the boys, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of aggression. And when we took closer looks at their home environments, where they come from, there really was a sense of abandonment. And in a lot of cases, it wasn't just one parent missing, but a lot of the times there were both parents missing. So in this country, there's also a common trend of children being raised by their grandparents, especially in rural or township communities. So what I'm getting at is, when it comes to boys in particular, we know that the male species are a rough housing type of species. You know, we grow up with that physicality, with that innate physicality. And so when you don't have a healthy mentor or a healthy channel to exercise that innate desire, you tend to turn on your community, or they tend to turn on those that they perceive to be weaker than them, without that healthy figure in their life to guide them. So what I'm getting at is how much of an impact does that have psychologically on young boys, where they look around them and they realize that they don't have a mom or they don't have a dad, but they look at their friends and their friends have a mom and a dad, but they're being raised by their grandmother or their grandfather who's just too tired to deal with them, too tired to play with them. And so they end up being vulnerable to outside influences. So whether this be their friends or people who are up to criminal activity. So how exactly can we help, or what exactly can we do for those children who are vulnerable to outside influences because they don't have a healthy home dynamic to lean on? They don't have a mother or a father to tell them, you can't behave like this because of A, B, and C, or a parent to check them and protect them from outside influences. What can we do for those children who desperately need that safety net, that warm, loving, but also disciplined family structure that can actually protect them and also equip them to become holistic and well-rounded adults going forward?
Thank you so much for that excellent question. I have to reflect that it's a really heavy one, right? And I just want to make a space for that because we're asking these questions, and I think it's so important to reflect for your listeners that these are incredibly hard questions because they are many people's reality. And I'm so hesitant to kind of give an answer that unintentionally undermines people's lived experiences, right?
Yeah.
I think the answer that I can give is every connection you have with people is important, right? And I mean this for you guys, I mean for your listeners. If you leave here with anything, leave knowing that every single contact you have with someone can be impactful. And I'm not avoiding your question. I am, however, really cautious because there's no good answer. Because this is the lived reality, is that people don't necessarily have secure households. Whether that is financially secure, whether it is emotionally secure, whether it is even just really food security. Many people are living without even bare minimum of security. And that is, let me be specific. So we're speaking about young men. I'm not going to say that the absent fathers is the reason we see issues in young men. I don't believe that. The reason I'm saying that is because, as I've referred to earlier, if you have at least one secure attachment, and that can be with a grand or whoever it may be, you have more protective protective factors than somebody who has mom and dad, but mom and dad have substance abuse issues, there's major domestic violence, and, right? In fact, I've recently read research that says the most lethal combination is poverty and mental health issues in the parents. So there are hazards in if there is an absent father or if there are not those primary caregivers. But if that child who maybe is in a child-headed household, right, they're being raised by a sibling, which is absolutely not ideal, that child, older sibling, definitely doesn't have the capacity to raise a well-rounded child. And I don't say that with judgment, I say that because they are still a child themselves, they should still be receiving that kind of support. But if that is the scenario, but let's say they go to school and they have this wonderful teacher who sits with them every morning for 5 minutes and says, how are you? Wow, you did this today. Wow, you're working so hard. I can see how much you've improved. Yeah, sure, you're working so hard on the rugby team, 5 minutes. And that child walks away from that conversation and they're like, wow, I do have strengths. I do have abilities. I am working really hard. That is transformative. So when I say that every moment of contact you have with someone can be impactful for them, I don't say that because I'm avoiding the question. I say that because it is the best tool we have to recognize that when you're in conversation with somebody, be really attentive to them, listen to them, see them in their context, right? What family do you come from? What is your situation, right? Not to be biased towards it, but to recognize what are this person's challenges, how are they experiencing their challenges, how can I be a support to you? Even if it's just, I'm listening for 5 minutes and I'm giving you an encouraging word. That is often extremely transformative in someone's experience.
I see. And I like the fact that you brought up the teacher aspect, because teachers essentially are a child's guardian for the time that they spend with them in school, because most of a child's day is spent in school, and that impact of having an adult figure, a positive adult figure, does a lot for a child's well-being in terms of their own upbringing. Should they not have
Absolutely.
Exactly, yeah. Should they not have parents or grandparents to care for them? So I think I want to move on to the next part, but staying within the family dynamics, but I want to focus more on relationships, right? So in terms of relationships, I just wanted to just dwell on the genders, the two different genders in terms of gender roles. Like, and staying with men's mental health, what would you say are some issues women currently have with men today?
My goodness, the dynamics of this conversation with this lady psychologist and these gentlemen.
We good.
Okay. Yes, I say that out of humor. All right, so I mean, look, I've taken this from research, but I've also taken this just, from my general experience of life. I think it's really difficult, and I'll kind of preface this with, when I work with people, I do avoid assumptions, right? So I've put this onto a piece of paper, but my feeling is that you need to be individualized in your approach. You need to really be able to see people and a couple in context. To make broad generalizations about the issues that couples are facing is really hazardous, right? But in general, I would say that the main issues are poor communication, controlling and or abusive behaviors or thinking, limited effective conflict management strategies, infidelity, and limited holistic sharing of duties, right? So that is household functioning, financials, emotional, all of those kind of things. And I'm just maybe wanting to hear, but from the rest in the group, what their thoughts are.
Sure.
I
So
just
yeah, go on, Rest.
Okay, Kelly, I just have a quick question. So I'm noticing that you highlighting that it's basically a constant battle with yourself, trying to ensure that your mental health is in check. And I just want to know, how do you know that you've healed? Because people usually say you've healed if you can look past that situation, it doesn't make you cry anymore, and so forth. And if you've reached that point of healing, is it still then you're still a lifelong journey of trying to work to ensure you don't go back? Because I mean, some people would maybe, let's say, after substance abuse, and they get to a point where they're better, and then they stop with the drugs and so forth. But maybe years later, they go back to the drugs, and because of this similar issue that people had said they'd healed from. So how do you know you've actually healed? When you have healed, how do you actually ensure that you stay on check?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think it's about, there was this word that was mentioned earlier, right? Resilience. As humans, we truly are, and we actually, our brains are hardwired to help us adapt to certain situations. Unfortunately, that means that there's kind of adaptation that happens, which is where, let's say, for example, I can't deal with the emotion of this situation or this experience, and I detach, right? Yes, you're going to feel better because you're just simply not with it, right? But it's not useful. Then you get into a relationship and the issues become different, or I can't relate to this person in the way that I need to because I'm actually pretty detached still. So healing is, I really want to go back to what I started with, which is that it's not either or, it's both and. Meaning that you work with what is useful and what is not useful, right? So I work a lot in narrative therapy, which effectively is, what is the story of your life? What is the problem story of your life? What is your preferred story? How would you prefer things to look? If you don't want to be the angry, reactive character anymore, who do you want to be? How do you want to write your story? Right? And it then becomes a case of, well, what are the voices in your story that are important? Who feeds into this character of a calm, collected, rational person then? And who has previously fed into the angry, reactive story, right? And starting to tone down the voices that have fed that problem story and turn up the voices that feed into this preferred story. And what I mean by that is, for the example that you've made of a person who has battled with addiction, often people relapse because there's really what we call sort of dual issues. So there are psychiatric issues as well as physiological issues, because there are components of addiction that are physiological. So you're constantly walking a line of really being aware of your cravings and things like that, as well as then being aware of both physical triggers as well as emotional triggers. So it's, if a person relapses, it's not necessarily that they are not healed. It is perhaps that their story started to change again, and there were things that they were not really happy with. But as opposed to being more aware of it and in tune with it and kind of going, well, what am I not happy with here? And what do I need to change? And whose voice do I need to be listening to, right? Who are the voices I need to bring into my life? They maybe were not responsive enough to that. And then at some point there was maybe a lot of stress, and then there was a trigger. And then it was unfortunately just a perfect disaster, right? You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah,
then
definitely.
maybe after that, they have more awareness. They can clearly see, shit, this is where, this is where my story went a bit off the rails, and this is what I wasn't so aware of at that time. You know, maybe it's a case of, oh, things were going really well in the relationship. I was in a good position at work. You know, I was socializing well. I was being really cautious with my influences. Then maybe your boss changed and you got new management and you really weren't seeing eye to eye with this management. No, I'm fine. I'm still doing great. Then things start to go a little bit sideways in the relationship. No, I'm fine. I'm great. My story's still good. And then one of your mates, I don't know, dings your car. And suddenly that night you're like, I think I'm going to take a hit of heroin tonight. And I'm really not saying this nonchalantly. Unfortunately, this is frequently what we see with people who present seeking mental health support, is that I cannot believe I had this response to this tiny thing. And I always say to people, well, why did the Titanic sink? And they go, well, either it's, I don't know, or there was an iceberg. Yeah, okay. Why did they hit the iceberg? I don't know. They didn't see it, or they didn't turn in time. Yeah, they didn't see it, and by the time they saw it, they were too close, because underneath the part they couldn't see was huge, and that is what sunk the Titanic. This is humans, and I think we are talking about men, and I can bring it to men in that when we are raising young men, don't cry, toughen up, put some dirt on it. That is unfortunately what you are doing in their brains, is you are severing those connections of awareness to, this is my experience, this is my response to the experience, this is my thinking about it. You are kind of creating a situation where they will easily detach. Oh, I'm not supposed to show this emotion, so then I turn it off. I'm fine. It's fine. And then as they grow older and it's stressful. We live in an extremely stressful world and society. You are supposed to have responses to that. And that is how your system regulates. Oh, okay, this is how I feel, this is what I need to do. And then if you don't have that awareness of this is how I feel and this is what I need to do, it is very easy to fall into a trap of an unhealthy coping mechanism, right? A substance, something that helps you to detach, right? Or having like hookup culture and things like that, things that just bring easy, good hormones in, but then unfortunately there's a lot of emotional fallout often, right? This is the sort of long-term effect of that kind of parenting.
No, I got you.
Okay, that was deeply, deeply, deeply insightful. I'm sure the guys took a lot away from that. But just to circle back on my previous question, where I was asking what issues women have with men, I believe you wanted to get our thoughts. I'm not too sure what you asked, so can you just kind of repeat that and then, yeah, we'll just go on and answer that.
Okay, yeah. So my thoughts are that the main issues come down to there being kind of poor reciprocal communication. You talk, I talk, we hear each other. Often there are issues of control, and I think this can go both ways of men controlling and women controlling. Then also if there are any kind of abusive behaviors or thinking that a partner doesn't have insight into, right? That is what we often see on social media in terms of gaslighting, where I have an issue with something, I disown any kind of responsibility for that issue. That to me circles really closely just to poor communication often. And then limited effective conflict management strategies, right? So once we are having an argument, do we have the resources to sort it out in an effective way? Often no, and that does speak to, well, how were we raised? So in couples counseling, we do look at the individual people, their upbringings, their beliefs, and all of these kind of things, because they do impact how we function in our relationships. And then one of the other things I mentioned was infidelity, and also when there is not equal sharing of duties and responsibilities in a household. If we're talking about, let's say, a couple that's living together, raising kids together, that kind of thing.
I
And I'm just
see.
wondering what the group's perspectives are on those issues, if there's agreement, if there's anything anyone would like to add before we discuss further.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I think I will go ahead and start.
okay, go
Or
ahead.
do you want to start, Dima?
Yeah. So I thought I'd add something that's kind of a question for Kelly, but it's related to this topic specifically. So a lot of men have this feeling or this perception or the experience in relationships, specifically with communication, where they feel as if whenever they open up to their partners and actually show that vulnerability, not all the time, but oftentimes a lot of men tend to feel as if their partners aren't always really equipped to deal with their emotions when they actually expose them or when they actually express them to their partners. And as a result, a lot of men do one of two things. They either kind of shut down and they don't communicate, which is obviously wrong, but at the same time, they do that because when they did show some vulnerability, they feel as if their partner didn't really know what to do with that information and they couldn't really relate. And there was also this perception that it makes them look weak. And obviously, this doesn't apply to all partners, all female partners. Some women do have that ability to let their partner be vulnerable and actually hear them out and comfort them. But a lot of men do have this feeling that they don't want to be vulnerable, and so that gets in the way of their ability to communicate with their partners effectively. So, what would you say? Is there truth to that? How do you feel about that? And if you do think that is true, what can we do to meet each other halfway as men and women when it comes to exposing our emotions and actually being vulnerable in a healthy environment? Because a lot of men, when they sense that they can't truly be vulnerable with their partners, they tend to, as I said, shut down. Or what they will do is they'll take that unloading and they'll take it to their male friends or their fathers or their brothers. And so when that happens, those men find a good avenue or an alternative But then when they come back home, their partner's like, why can't you speak to me? Why can't you be vulnerable? Why aren't you talking to me? But then the problem is they've already done that communication with someone else because they felt more comfortable doing that. So do you think that's healthy, or is it maybe something that gets in the way of the dynamic of the relationship?
That's a really good question. I think my first question would be how, right? How is this expression happening? Because if vulnerable expression looks like I lose my temper and I scream and then afterwards I say, oh, but I was expressing to you how I was feeling, that's concerning for me, right? However, if we are just talking about a moment where maybe a gentleman became tearful, they were talking about really a hectic day or a hectic situation in the family, and they got tearful, and then afterwards their partner couldn't support them either with a hug, with reflecting, oh my gosh, I can see how much this is affecting you. I'm so sorry. I'm here for you. You know, that kind of reciprocal support. Instead, maybe they were shocked and they kind of walked away, or yeah, that's deeply problematic. And then honestly, if I was seeing someone who reflected that experience to me in therapy, my first question would be, well, what makes you want to remain in this relationship? Because one of the core aspects of a relationship is, am I supported? Can I support, and am I supported? And if you have an experience where you've not been supported, unless there's a conversation about that results in, this is our way forward, this is how we're going to work on this thing that we've just identified that is potentially an issue in our relationship, then I would say seriously consider leaving an unsupportive relationship like that, right? There is absolutely a need, if we're talking about men's mental health and we are actively asking our communities of men to be more vulnerable in order to reduce reactive responses to situations, then we need to be understanding of that. We need to make space for that. We need to offer support with that. And I don't mean support in terms of then the partner, the girlfriend, the wife, whatever the case may be, becomes the therapist. I strongly discourage that kind of dynamic too. If you can see that this is something that is deeply affecting your partner in a way you've never seen before, you then say, listen, would you consider seeing a mental health care professional, you know? And no, that's not everybody's preferred means of healing. And a colleague of mine said the other day, she said, psychologists don't own healing. And that's absolutely true. People experience profound healing in many avenues, sometimes religious, sometimes cultural or traditional, sometimes just in really supportive networks, you know? What it means, though, is if you experience those kind of dynamics, don't be content with them. I don't know if it's a good enough reason to say, well, I'm now not going to be vulnerable again. I think then it becomes a situation of, I'm going to find the person I can be vulnerable around and who understands what it means for a man to express and be vulnerable and understands the nuances of why that's difficult. And I think this is also where a lot of, well, let's say mental health care practitioners, this is where our community responsibility comes in, is really offering psychoeducation to communities of, this is maybe what a man struggling with mental health looks like, right? A man who becomes more irritable, who is more reactive, and then holding that person accountable to, when you see this, don't tolerate it under the narrative of, well, men will be men, right? Or boys will be boys. No. Reflect that you're upset, but you're getting angry, and I'm not going to accept that, right? This is, again, if I go back to that moment earlier in our podcast where maybe it's too late for adult men, I disagree. Because if somebody says that to you and you're in a place where you can receive it and you can recognize, I really do want to be able to respond to things differently. That's an opportunity for growth, for change. I think I may have gone down a bit of a tangent. Maybe you want to redirect me.
Yeah, no, but
Nah,
I
no
completely hear
worries.
you. Mm.
So, Ndima, are you satisfied with that answer before I let Sheldon take over?
Totally.
Okay, Sheldon, over to you, my guy.
Thanks, Kelly, for that answer. Thanks, Ndima, for that question. It was a good question. Kelly, I think maybe you can just give us your opinion. I'm just going back to my intro where I spoke about how gender roles have changed within a relationship. If we go back maybe 2 generations to our grandparents, the male was the provider, worked all day, and the female was the stay-at-home mom, looked after the kids. That's no longer like that. Like I said, with women empowerment, we're still far away from where we need to be. We still have a lot of work to do. But if we go 30, 40 years down the line, things are going to look a lot different. So how do we create a norm amongst men to be with, like, to have that switch in gender role, if you understand what I'm saying, where the wife will be the CEO, and it's not necessarily that the man will be the CEO and the main provider in that relationship. So how do we bring in that change to our kids and our future generations with the gender roles coming?
Thank you for that question, Sheldon. This is when I highlighted one of the issues. It was the sharing of duties, right? And in my practice and just I think in my life in general, I've seen a lot of couple issues and couple dissatisfaction come from that unequal sharing of responsibilities, which does often connect to gender role expectations, right? So that is, a woman must care for the household, primary care of the children, father is in provider role, making sure financially everyone is okay, that there's a home, that kind of thing. And like you've said, that has changed dramatically, and it's very much a context because how people have that experience in South Africa is probably vastly different than what they'll experience in America or in Australia, right? I think it comes down to, and again, this is chicken and egg because how was I raised, right? Often people will come into a couple therapy and they'll say, but this is how I was raised. This is what was normal in my family. And again, it becomes that question of, okay, I understand. I can make space for that. Ultimately, it comes down to, are you content with that? Is that what you want to have continue in your relationship? Or do you want something different because you can see how this is jeopardizing this relationship, right? And I can maybe make that practical in terms of there is really a significant issue with not even just household responsibilities, right? But childcare. That are we both equally involved in raising our children in terms of providing for their needs, right? So financially, but also are we both equally involved in making sure that they are emotionally provided for? And I think this really one of the significant issues that lead to what we're talking about now in terms of men's mental health is that it starts with fathers feeling like, well, it's mom's responsibility to relate to our children in that way. I'm there to provide for these physical needs. That to me is something that is really no longer useful. Every person of every gender should be able to relate to the children in their care and meet their needs over every domain. I make sure that you are physically safe. I make sure that you are financially provided for. I make sure that you have food security. I make sure that I am consistently aware and meeting your emotional needs. So often, children who are acting out, young boys who are acting out, I always encourage parents to ask, what do you think is the need that is not being met? And we often talk about just positive time, meaning that 5 minutes, I'm sitting with you, I'm talking to you. I'm asking about your day. I'm not punishing you. I'm not shouting at you for anything. Just 5 minutes where we are just sitting, spending time together, maybe doing an activity. And you're just talking to them and you're just really being that positive interaction of, oh, wow, you've tried really hard with this. I can see how hard you're working, right? Oh, wow, you drew a beautiful picture. Just that really positive interaction. And very often parents experience that the negative behaviors they've been seeing dramatically reduce because there was a need for attention, for connection. And once that need was met, the behaviors reduced. Because the thing about negative behavior is that even if I'm getting shouted at, it's attention. It's somebody focused on me, even if it's negative. And so we focus on, are you creating these moments where I'm just interacting? And when it comes then to couples and negotiating these roles, it becomes a question of how are we going to divide these roles in a way that works for us and works for our family. So if there is a couple that still wants to have traditional gender roles and they don't find that it impacts them or their children negatively, that can be okay. But if ultimately the members of a couple are not seeing eye to eye, and these sort of areas of finances, of position in family, right? So if there's a fundamental disagreement of there's a leader in this household, right? If a man is thinking, I am the head of this household, and the woman is thinking, there is no head of our household, we are equal partners, that is a fundamental misalignment of values that is going to impact every aspect of the relationship. So I think the best way to get ahead of this is to have these conversations with partners, with potential partners of how do you see the world? How do you see a family? How do you see a partnership, right? Do you see it as a partner or do you want someone who's leading the household? To really have these conversations beforehand and not make assumptions about, well, this is a black man and so a black man believes this, or this is a white woman and the white woman believes this. Have the conversation with the person in front of you and say, what do you believe about these things? How do you imagine that this would work in a couple? Is that useful?
Very much so. Very much so. I'm not sure if Sheldon is satisfied, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice from Kelly for everyone in that. So thanks, Kelly. Appreciate that.
Okay, and then we can move on to the next aspect of this pressing issue of men's health. And we know that this is something many people deal with in their struggles. You know, people usually lean onto some sort of vice when it comes to either they just want to let loose, take the edge off, or they're really dependent on whatever substance they're using. But the problem of substance abuse. So the question that I would like to address is, how much does substance abuse impact a person's mental health? And what are some of the early signs of mental health issues when you mixing it with substance abuse?
Thank you so much for that question. Absolutely, it is, as a mental health care professional, it is something that we take very seriously and that we worry about, because there is a lot of risk of suicide and self-harm, and because there's often a lot of risk taking that's involved. A person is truly there. It can be a case of life and death, you know. So it's something that we take seriously. You know, talking generally about substances is difficult, right? And I remember reading on, when I was much, much younger, IFL. Anyone remember IFL? I remember reading that tobacco was the most harmful substance. And I thought about this and I thought about this and I was like, how? And the reason that it is the most harmful substance is because it is normalized, right? It's well known that it says it on the package of your cigarettes, of your vape. It says this this substance can kill you, right? It's known to cause cancer, and yet it is still something that is sold legally and is a huge industry. We actually worry the most about our socially acceptable vices, right? Smoking, drinking, because there is damage that is happening. There is well-researched damage that is happening, but we continue to do it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that word of vices. It becomes a situation where, again, have self-awareness. How am I using this? For what reason am I using this? And has my usage changed? So psychologically, when we look at our diagnostics and statistics manual, it says it helps us make a distinction between usage, misuse, and abuse. And for example, with alcohol use in South Africa, it's difficult to establish. We have really strong drinking culture in South Africa. And so people will say, but it's normal. I was raised in a family where you drink a case of beers over a weekend, right? And that was normal, and nobody ever said my father was an alcoholic. And often people grow up in homes where there is a lot of normalization of substance abuse. And if that has been the case, that person is more at risk of developing unhealthy coping mechanisms when they have stress. And that stress causes mental health challenges. Excuse me. So you have to have just insight into yourself. If I was a person who drank a 6-pack of beers and I suddenly become a person who drinks 12 beers, or I can't stop, right? Or now I'm not drinking beers anymore, I'm drinking a bottle of brandy. I'm drinking 2 bottles of brandy. Have awareness of yourself. Because yes, I know what the textbook says, and the textbook says you've been binge drinking if you've had more than 5 beers. That is not always helpful for really assessing whether somebody has a substance use disorder. And this is why I mentioned earlier in terms of that dual diagnosis, right? Recognizing if there is substance abuse as well as some sort of psychiatric or psychological disorder. Because we need to understand how those are going to impact each other. And again, context is very important. What kind of support does this person have? Or do they have a really huge lack of support? Because that's also going to factor into how are they able to manage their addiction? How are they able to manage other stresses in their life? This is a topic that really is extensive and huge, but absolutely the adverse childhood events that I've spoken about earlier, they are directly related to substance abuse problems we see in society and mental health issues that we see in society. They all really play very negatively into each other.
I see. And in terms of the various mental health diseases or mental disorders that are prevalent in society today, what are some substances or vices that I think my question is, what mental issues do some of these substances like trigger? Like you get some people who would say that marijuana sometimes triggers depression and anxiety, or alcohol triggers anxiety as well. So what kind of mental issues do these substances usually trigger in people, and how bad are the impacts?
So I find it very difficult to answer this question because even in adolescence, right, there is often already pre-existing depressive or anxious symptoms that very much influence whether the person will even experiment with a substance to start with. So I really struggled to say, okay, that the person first started to use substances and then develop mental health challenges, because often they are either coexisting or the symptoms were already there to some degree. But there are certain disorders something that we do worry about a lot when it comes to substance use is substance-induced psychosis, right? So there are certain substances where after excessive use, and it is research, but it's not always a clear case of we know what the cause is. There are sometimes genetic factors, there are environmental factors that contribute to after a person has used. It might be in terms of how much they've used or how often they've used, that they will develop psychosis. Psychosis being there are delusions or there are hallucinations. That is obviously really concerning because often it will result in either suicide or potentially homicide if there are, for instance, delusions where a person believes that somebody is out to get them, right? Or that they are seeing something that is trying to harm them and they are responding to that. That is truly what we are often really concerned about when somebody reports substance abuse. And it is something to take very seriously if somebody is talking to you about, if they suddenly seem way more paranoid than you ever knew them to be, right? Or they're suddenly talking about really unusual beliefs. And I don't say that with judgment. I think I'm a person who has pretty unusual beliefs. But if you know this person and you've not ever known them to talk about these kind of higher realms and things like that and having connections with that, yes, that's a time where you say, hey, bro, do you want to take a drive with me? And you take them to the hospital. Are you guys satisfied with that answer?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the paranoia and delusion aspect because that's what you come across when you looking up these type of symptoms and long-term effects of drug and alcohol abuse when it comes to mental health, because people do talk about induced psychosis, sorry, and how that affects someone. And I like that you talked about knowing someone, knowing their value system and their belief system, and should they deviate from that and start talking about having connection to a higher realm and all that, that is very alarming. I'm sure Ndima wanted to ask something, so I'll just move on to him quickly.
Yeah, so just to sort of like wrap up
Speak up,
the
brother.
top. Oh, my bad. Just to sort of wrap up on the aspect of substance abuse, do you think we overestimate or underestimate the role that trauma has on substance abuse? So, because there's this idea that many addicts gravitate towards substances as a response to trauma. So, I'm not really sure what the percentages are, but do you think we overestimate or underestimate the role of trauma when it comes to people relying on substances and becoming addicted to them, or what do you think?
Thank you for that, Ndima. I would not say that it's overestimated. I do think that it's sort of a unhealthy coping mechanism that many people do have in response to having experienced trauma.
Mm.
Do I think that there's a direct link? I mean, honestly, I'm searching my brain for research that I've recently read about this, and I don't have the research driven answer. I don't. But if I think of my experience of if there's a direct link between a person having experienced trauma is definitely them going to become an addict or a user, not necessarily, because again, there are so many factors to be considered, right? Both in terms of risk factors, right? Environmental and individual and interpersonal risk factors. So, for example, if you came from a household where there already was somebody who was a substance user, and that is already effectively a trauma, right? Because chances are you may have seen that person hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. There's a fairly high likelihood of that. Then, yes, you are maybe more likely to use substances because you've been raised in a household where it's somewhat been normalized. And even though there was a trauma from it, there's still that really strong kind of influence of it having been normal. It was normal for mom to look half days all day, right? Or for dad to come home and drink the whole bottle of whiskey and shout at everyone and then pass out. If it's normalized in your experience, unfortunately, that is what poses the greatest risk. If it was normal and nobody ever said to you, it's not really okay for your dad to drink the bottle of whiskey and then hit your mom. And often this is actually what we're talking about, is that this will be contained within a household. We don't talk about these things because they're shameful, right? Or they are perceived as being shameful. So you go to school, you come home, this is your experience for your entire childhood. Unfortunately, if that then leads to you feeling like, well, this is normal, there are endless things that can happen as a result of that. Again, I come back to, what are the contributing factors, right? Some people have really good protective factors in terms of maybe they are really strong in sport, or maybe they are really strong academically, or maybe they have that teacher that was paying attention, or they develop a love for the church and that ends up being something that's really supportive for them. So truly, the greatest risk factor for a person being mentally unwell is if they have minimal protective factors. So yes, I'm not speaking specifically about substance use here, but in general, if a person has experienced trauma in some form or another and has minimal protective factors, that is the group that we consider to be most at risk, right? And that is why I really am emphasizing on this platform, take every contact you have with people seriously and know its impact, because it is not necessarily about the huge intervention. It is about that person who really feels truly hopeless and feels like they have no person or no support in the world, and they go to the shop and the cashier greets them really nicely and says, "How are you?" and says, "Wow, you're wearing an awesome shirt today. You look so handsome, sir." And you walk out that shop and you're kind of like, okay, that's different. And you maybe look at things a little bit differently after that.
Very, very interesting.
I guess what this all boils down to is the societal factors, the general norms and behavioral patterns we have around substance abuse or drinking, and the culture we've all adopted in terms of how we perceive drinking and drug use. And it's not a one size fits all thing. It really depends on how a person grew up and the influences that shape them, that affect their view of drug consumption or alcohol consumption. That really determines how bad their problems get when it comes to substance abuse and addiction, and ultimately their mental health. So I think what I would like to do right now is just to give the floor open to all of us as to what has really helped us in terms of mental health and how we deal with life situations and overcome any adversities, even though we may be going through our own difficulties mentally and emotionally. So I'll just start with Sheldon and then take it from there.
Oh, shot. But first of all, thanks to everyone. Yeah, I think this was a good session. I think a lot of people that will listen to this will also get a lot out of it. But just for me, obviously, what's helped a lot with me, I think the biggest step is just acknowledgement. I think for a long time, we're all in denial in that. And then just acknowledgement and then practice, practice, practice. And if you fall off, just keep getting back on and trying again, and not giving up.
Hectic. Very good. Why did I say hectic?
So I make you blush there.
Yeah,
No.
go on, Raz.
Yeah, no. Just to add on what Sheldon was saying, definitely acknowledgement. It also took me time to acknowledge certain issues, and also therapy. I was also struggling with the stigma behind therapy because when I wanted to go to therapy initially, and I spoke to a few people, it was actually men, and I didn't get good responses. People weren't encouraging therapy. So I was quite scared. And when I did eventually make the decision to go to therapy, I wouldn't say people received it well because when I spoke to people about it, that I was actually attending therapy sessions, some people look at me funny, some people look at me like I'm crazy. And I knew deep down inside that, you know what, I need this assistance to change my life. So yeah, man, people must just acknowledge, and if you can, please reach out to someone. If not, like Kelly was saying earlier on, if you struggle, maybe you're speaking to a therapist, maybe you reach out to someone who's close to you, a friend, a family member, someone who you can unload and be vulnerable with.
Mm. Yeah, so just to add on to what everyone else has already said, of course, reach out to people, make use of the people around you, whether that comes in the form of therapy, whether that comes in the form of friends, family. But I think just to keep it a little bit more simple, I think we also just need to remember to pay attention to our health, you know. Working out, going to the gym, going for a jog, just exercise in general does wonders not only for you physically but mentally as well because there's a very great amount of mental clarity that comes from that afterwards, of course, because it's quite difficult, you know, but afterwards it's always worth it because you really clear that mental fog. And I think when it comes to anxiety, for example, I'm someone who used to suffer from it a lot, but I barely suffer from it anymore. And I think that's because I took the steps to actually consider why am I feeling like this? And from my own personal experience, I think the anxiety came from the fact that I knew there were things that I needed to do, but there were things that I was avoiding. And so that I guess on a subconscious level kind of caused me to go into a state of distress. So just journal, self introspect, and come to terms with what exactly it is you need to do and stop avoiding it because you do need to meet things head on. So, exercise, journal, meditate, face things head on when you know there are things you have to deal with. But also, I think one thing that we like to understate is please be careful of what you put in your body. Watch what you eat because I think a lot of the time our mental states are affected by the quality of what we eat, and we really do underestimate this. So try and eat as clean as you can, and I promise you will start to see some incremental changes. Like they'll be small, but they'll build up over time. And when you combine those things with therapy and speaking to your loved ones and journaling and meditating and exercising, then I think it won't cure what you're going through, but it'll definitely help you deal with things with a much more clear mind. So from my personal experience, that's what really has helped me.
Awesome. And then from my side, just to close things off, I think the most important thing that I've learned is don't be afraid to be alone. Don't be afraid to be alone. Take that time to really understand who you are from the depths of your very being and understand how your own mind is wired, why you always have particular thoughts at a certain time. And like the best form of understanding that is through self-awareness. And self-awareness is a journey. You start off with journaling, finding out what's going on with you at a particular time and understanding that this is what you're feeling at this moment and those feelings are just feelings in a moment of time. They're not permanent. Your feelings don't define who you are. It's how you act on those feelings that actually define that. And what worked for me is that when I was in a really, really dark space and I started having like suicidal thoughts, that was something new to me, you know? That's when I realized that, okay, something was wrong. This is something I've never thought about, you know? That's when I reached out for help and I started my journey with therapy and yeah, with therapy and just attending support groups. And also don't be afraid to take that path. Don't be afraid to go to therapy and don't be afraid of people judging you, you know, because there's also a stigma around medication and psychiatric medication, which people don't have an understanding of, because once you start taking antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills, people automatically assume that there's something mentally wrong with you, like your brain isn't functioning properly. It's like when you have a broken leg, you go to a doctor, right? So it's the same principle. When you don't feel okay and your mood is lower than usual and your brain can't regulate uh it can't regulate the hormones that it needs normally, you go to a doctor who specializes in that field and you take your medication. So we also need to really look at the biases around that in terms of medical treatment and mental health, because that is something that is very important. And what else could I think about? You know, also be very aware of the people you surround yourself with, because whether you like it or not, you need to study the people whom with you live with and you surround yourself on a daily, because you'll find that the reason you're miserable most of the time is because you're around toxic people, which you need to cut out in your life. So your friends, your family, like people who just bring you down, that has a very huge impact on your mental health. So don't be afraid to make that decision to choose yourself first and cut certain people out of your life, because you'll start to see that things drastically improve when certain people are not involved in your life anymore. And don't be afraid to make that call and just reach out to whoever you think is trustworthy and non-judgmental, and also explore the different helplines. They are great resources. Like, there's a place called Masitete Counseling Service in East London where they offer free counseling by trained counselors. And there's also the PE branch called Revive. There's the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. There are great resources online that offer practical advice, meditation, yoga, prayer, surrounding yourself with good people, people who genuinely want what's best for you. And that may not always be your family, but there are people out there who would appreciate who you are, and just understand that you're never alone and your thoughts aren't really who you are. It's how you act on those thoughts that define your actions and ultimately who you are. So you're never alone. Always remember you are king. No matter what life throws at you, you're more than capable of overcoming. And yeah, I'd like to say thank you once again to Kelly and Sheldon for joining us today. This has been a great episode, and I hope it helps whoever listens and whoever really needs to hear this. And if you're one of those people, I really hope that you take away something that really goes a long way in helping you get out of whatever situation you're going through. And yeah, my name is Sipo Guana, joined by Ndima Silwana, Ramut Msane, Sheldon Grebe, and Kelly Chandler. Thank you so much, guys.
Till next time.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you guys. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye, Kelly.
Yeah.